Welcome to 2020 Politics War Room with James Carville. I'm Al Hunt. I'm here at American University. Only one other person here, our great producer, Kyle. We are more than 6 feet apart, however. We are proud partners with the Sign Institute at AU, and we're about the only people on the AU campus right now. Social distancing matters for anyone out there who's listening. We have some really important guests to discuss this crisis in a moment, but first, please subscribe to 2020 Politics War Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Today, Deborah and James Fallows are with us. They're among America's foremost public intellectuals. They've written over a dozen books, lived all over the world, and most recently, for 4 or 5 years, traveled in a single-engine airplane. Carville, you know I get nervous with three. All around America to learn and report on communities outside of the national media and the political spotlight. And they came back and wrote a highly acclaimed and bestseller, Our Towns, and came back pretty encouraged. Matter of fact, very encouraged. Deborah, let me start with you. You were encouraged by the vitality that you saw in these smaller towns, Columbus, Duluth, Greenville. This pandemic is going to hit them too. Maybe not as bad as New York or Seattle, but it's going to hit them. Do you have any sense of how they're going to respond, what the reaction's going to be?
Yeah, thanks, Al. This is interesting. We've been back in touch with a lot of the towns that we visited, tiny ones from 1,400 people to big ones like Columbus, Ohio, with 600,000 people. And there's one commonality, is that it seems that aside from the big cities on the coasts, that the inland towns or the smaller towns are a bit slower to react, or slower to realize, I should say, that about this pandemic. But once they realized it, once something hit and it became personal, they're really kicking into gear with the same kind of local activity that we had seen all during our travels. One of the really interesting ones is Ajo, Arizona, population 2,400 in the Sonoran Desert. And I was talking with them yesterday, and they said, now that they realize how serious this is, they're doing everything that the big cities are doing in terms of isolating and stuff. But there's a difference, because they realize they don't have any fallbacks. They've got to rely on themselves like they always have been in these times. And it makes them real nervous in things like, will the internet fail? Will electricity fail? Which happens often in the summer there. And what about our health clinic? They've got nowhere to go except a hospital that's 80 miles away if the health clinic runs into trouble.
Wow. A crisis usually brings us together, but at least some of the early polling has shown a bit of a red and blue divide, and Democratic governors, with a couple exceptions like Mike DeWine in Ohio and Larry Hogan in Maryland, Democratic governors like Cuomo have been far more aggressive and I would say forthright on this. You were in Greenville. I know my wife went down with you I thought it was a terrific PBS piece on your travels to Greenville. So you're talking to people down there. Do you see any of that red-blue divide, or local communities oblivious to that?
I would say that we are seeing the same thing that we saw during our travels before the whole world changed, which is that while people may differ politically on their beliefs, when it comes to doing things locally, it's beyond that. It's a step beyond politics, red or blue, Democrat or Republican or whatever, that people realize that the buck stops with them and that they're going to get something done. They are just going to do it together. And politics has always been a background issue in the kind of activity locally that we've seen. Jim, you can correct me.
No, don't you dare do that, Jim Fallows. But
no. Wise answer, Al. That's as we all know, there is a secret to long-standing marriages, which I think everybody on this podcast understands.
You guys have been married for almost 50 years, so stick with it, Jim.
That is true. Yes, thank you. We're still getting started. I know Deb is, of course, exactly right, and also. And also, it's the case that as she says, that when your attention is concentrated with what's going to happen to a city, we've seen, not the kind of partisan divide that is so typical in D.C., but the practicality. Just as Deb's been talking with people in Ajo and Columbus, I've been focusing a lot on Erie, Pennsylvania recently, where they have a very clear case of a general tendency. The clear case is that the salvation of a lot of these struggling cities in the last 4 or 5 years has been small businesses. It's been little shops, little restaurants, little breweries, little nonprofit organizations, all these things which have moved into downtown and helped to bring back to life cities that have been having trouble. And of course, these are exactly the institutions that are worst hit right now. There are layoffs of 80%, 90% of the staff in a lot of these organizations. And I was really impressed talking with people in Erie about a whole new plan they have if you had a locally conscious revival program at the state level, the federal level, et cetera, what it would be. And so I think that a positive sign of a really, really dark moment is people who've spent the last decade thinking, how can old industrial cities recover from the 2008 collapse? They're now thinking, they're using that knowledge to think, what can we do now when all of our small businesses that have saved us are all in this kind of nuclear winter, and how can we bring them back? And that's that is a necessary next step.
Well, Erie has my friend Tom Hagen there who's lending a hand, I'm sure. He's had a lot to do with that.
Yes.
This is my question for
Yep.
both of you. All of these places and places that you haven't been to, there's a leader. There's somebody that's respected. It might be a doctor, it might be a coach, it might be a principal, it might be a cleric, or business person. And we should have we need a massive propaganda campaign, and we have to enlist people across this country who are respected in their own communities. To hell with the politics. We have a public health crisis here that we got to push out that. Either you see any value in trying to, and they can do through technology and other things, identify local leaders and band them together to also have a local public health message.
So, James, I think that is exactly right and exactly the next step. And let me just use 2 national level examples and then pivot to the local. People in D.C. over the decades have, of course, known who Anthony Fauci is. And now the entire world knows who he is. And he's become essentially the moral and intellectual leader of the response to the virus right now, as long as he can maintain his position. I think at the state level, having nothing to do with party politics, Governor Cuomo in New York has been doing something similar too. And I think there are people like that around the country. And, without being cued by our conversation right now, exactly what Deb and I are planning to do, starting, now on the Atlantic site and other media that we have, is to identify some of these people, try to connect them. For example, I've been talking with a guy named Josh Friday in California, who's in charge of the whole sort of CCC type, using the New Deal reference, Youth Service Corps in California, trying to put them to work. Connecting him with a guy named Greg Behrman with a group called Nation Swell and a few other organizations that are thinking creatively about how they can respond. So, James, from your lips to our fingers, we're going to be typing about this for the foreseeable future, trying to identify these people.
I'm not sure people in Hattiesburg really listen to Dr. Fauci all the time. Probably a lot of them don't know who he is. But there's somebody in Hattiesburg, or there are 5 people in Hattiesburg. And it's got, it's probably an African-American leader, maybe someone in southern Mississippi. Maybe it's the respected doctor. I have no idea. Brett Favre.
I've heard some interesting things that are happening on the local level, and it's not necessarily a single person like the mayor or the Chamber of Commerce or a teacher who's stepping up, but it's people who are stepping up in their own little areas of power or influence or expertise. Back to Ajo, Arizona, which is not a really connected place. They kind of think of themselves as being off the grid. There is one grocery store in town, and they printed up flyers on the whole COVID-19, everything that you should possibly want to do or note about it. And they put it into every single grocery bag that went home with people. And so that was a way of connecting with the entire town that was very simple, but very effective because everybody shopped at that grocery store. Similarly, in Eastport, Maine, which has a very fabulous small town paper, they have regular updates on what you should know today. Here's what's going on. Here's the important stuff. And everybody reads that paper. So there are these ways of connecting to practically across the whole community in small areas that are happening. So I am really a believer in leadership in these various different silos, and people who are in those communities know best how to handle it because they know the whole skeletal and intravenous system of the town and how to get there.
One thing about Hattiesburg, James, just to interrupt, Hattiesburg, actually, we're there last year. That is an interesting place where they're developing that kind of local leadership. They have a young mayor named Toby Barker, who is quite an impressive, popular.
I met him. I know him.
Yeah, and they have a medical center there. And so I think that Hattiesburg is the kind of place where we have in mind where having local leadership will do something. So sorry to interrupt.
Well, good. I pulled one out of my ass here. Let me, John Barry, the great historian of the 1918 influenza, is a good friend of mine, and he called me. He was very excited because the New York Times took his op-ed piece. Of course, it was brilliantly done and accurate and everything else. And he said, that he said, I went on Breitbart. What do you think? And I said, you're 10 times more effective on Breitbart than the New York Times. Everybody that reads the op-ed page of the New York Times knows about social distancing and washes their hands. And I'm working on a piece, and it's called "It's the Stupid People Stupid." Because all of us, but what you and Deb do is something remarkable and different, but 98% of the people we know just talk to each other. And that's not going to work in a public health crisis.
Yes, I entirely agree. And I think as both of you well know from your reporting and your political life, probably the most important next step to make in alliances is faith organizations around the country. Because they really do, although they tend sometimes to be segregated by race and by political view, they are the great connective fabric of a lot of the kind of America that you're talking about reaching. And we found over the last year or two and going around the country that these are, again, even though Liberty University is defying the sort of the orders from the governor of Virginia about distancing and all the rest, we found most faith organizations to be open-minded about locally responsible activities. And I bet that would be the next place for the message to be directed and conveyed.
That would be encouraging. Look, I think a lot of what you have told us, Eastport and Erie, Hattiesburg, that certainly is encouraging. But in a national crisis, I think you would agree, Jim, we need national leadership. I mean, FDR and the Depression and the war, and as much as I thought the Iraq War was terrible, at least right after 9/11, I think that George W. Bush supplied that. We're not getting that now. We have a president who denied it for 7 or 8 weeks, called it a Democratic hoax a few weeks ago, now saying, it's more important to get back to work. We have to pay a price for that, don't we?
We are paying that price. And as we all have discussed over the years, in every presidency, there's something that nobody expected that president has to deal with out of nowhere. And whether it was 9/11, the most dramatic case, or, for every presidency, there is that situation. And it had been remarkable that had not happened during Donald Trump's time. There were problems, but not a catastrophe. We're having a catastrophe now, and his manifold limits in empathy and ability to appeal to the entire country and view of expertise are part of the problem the U.S. is dealing with at this moment. And so I guess all we can hope is that other parts of the system will reduce the damage. But my trademark optimism does not extend to thinking that he's going to do a better job than he has done so far.
Yeah, I told a friend the other day, I said, he's the anti-Ike. And they said, what do you mean he's the anti-Ike? I think one of the great letters that I have read from a public figure was Dwight D. Eisenhower on the eve of D-Day writing a memo that if Operation Overlord failed, it was his fault alone. These were brave young men, and they went into a noble cause, and it failed, and it's my responsibility and my fault. Trump is the absolute opposite. He bears no responsibility, he says, for any of this. And I think it was Deborah, Jim, one of you mentioned Andrew Cuomo earlier. That contrast is remarkable.
It certainly is. And to interrupt again for a second, as you were both saying before, that many governors of both parties are trying to play that role. I guess, I think Governor DeWine in Ohio has been the leader among Republicans, but also Governor Baker in Massachusetts. And so I think maybe there'll be some osmotic effect on governors to become leaders in the absence of national leadership.
My own view is we need a massive propaganda campaign on public health. And I go back and you study the Committee on Public Information during World War I. They had 77,000 people that stood up and gave a 4-minute patriotic speech as they were changing the reels in movie theaters. Right? I mean, it was a massively successful propaganda campaign. World War II, the great George C. Marshall bought Frank Capra in his office to produce propaganda films, Why We Fight, right? At any time when you're at war, propaganda can be a tool for good. Were there excesses? So we know, did the CPI go over the board sometimes? Yeah. Did Roosevelt go over the board? Yeah. Did Lincoln go over the board? Yeah. But I think you got immediate action and then clean it up after. But right now, I just don't see that massive public health initiative that we need to try to put the breaker on this thing.
Yeah, when Jim and I are watching the so-called press briefings every day, we've often started to say to each other how reminiscent it is of our days in China when we would be propagandized all over the place because that was the only thing that you'd hear in the public domain, and it just kind of is spine chilling to hear day after day a message that is untrue and disturbing and that you could see right through. But if enough people hear it enough times, it feels like it might be true, or at least push people in a certain direction.
Yes, I entirely agree. We have this bad propaganda that we've heard for the last 10 days or so out of the White House, and the good kind of public service message that at different times in American history has come out. I agree entirely with what you're saying, James. I guess it's worth thinking it's only been about 2.5 or 3 weeks that this has been in the forefront of public attention as a crisis. Obviously, the government has known about it for months, but in terms of public attention, it's only been a matter of a couple of weeks. But it is about time for the people who are expert at the right kind of public information, the people in Hollywood, the people who are, when Tom Hanks comes out of quarantine, he will be the guy he and his wife, Rita Wilson, to say, okay, here's what I've learned by having this disease. Here's what we need to do. He's the most trusted person in America right now. So if you all have connections with Tom Hanks, as we don't really, we urge you to have him be the Frank Capra of the year ahead.
Well, what I think is that they ought to go to the people at Pornhub or YouPorn and say, before you can enter this site, you have to listen to a 30-second propaganda public health message. Then you would start reaching people, right? I'm serious. And there's a betting market for March on how many clicks that Pornhub gets. And the over-under is 3 billion. So if you go there, you until you have Tom Hanks show you how to wash your hands and show you what 6 feet spacing is, you can't do it. I do that to these betting sites. I don't know, all these video games. I have no idea what these people are, but why these tech people need to come in and put it there where it's going to reach people at a granular level. And what we need to do with these recalcitrant clergy people, make a donation to the building fund. They'll come around.
Yeah.
They'll come around.
Well, also, Deb, if we can combine the churches and the porn sites, we might have most of America.
But yeah, what about the white nationalists? We got to go to them too. Go to the Klan site. Go to the fine people at Charlottesville site. They're going to kill you just as dead as Dr. Fauci's going to kill you.
Yeah. Okay. So here's one other thing that I've been hearing from people around the country. And I'm not sure quite how to phrase this, but there are two topics that we all know about that people are talking about with much more insistence, and I think a broader, like a bigger microphone. And one is where you don't get internet access. So all these, so many of these small towns are internet challenged that people don't get to go on, especially now that the libraries are closed, unless you hang out outside the library. So you're not going to go onto those sites. The other thing, so maybe a good outcome is that will become more part of, more insistent nationally. The other thing is everybody talks about the feeding stations, which is a terrible word, but having kids get fed in schools, as we all know they do, becomes kind of anonymous and you forget about it. And it just, it's not part of people's radar. But now every town is struggling with that, big towns or little towns. How are you going to feed these kids? And they really do rely on that. And everybody's going out to get their to-go grab bags wherever they're handing them out. But I just wonder what kind of effect that is going to have on a lot of people, because it's so personal, who haven't really thought about, well, either you haven't met it because you're not part of it, or you don't see it every day. You're glad your kid gets fit in school, but suddenly you have to go out of your way to get that food. So that issue, I think, is going to become bigger, and I think it is maybe a way to reach people also.
Yeah, that's really important, Deb, because I suspect I think what Congress is doing this week is necessary. I'm sure there are all kinds of flaws in anything they do this quickly, but getting money out to people is really, really important, and unemployment benefits out to people. But it's going to be weeks before they get that, and there are a lot of kids who may go hungry in those 3 or 4 weeks because that school lunch and school breakfast programs are huge in a lot of communities.
Yeah, and town by town, they're figuring it out because they're still getting that food, and but it's suddenly more complicated and cumbersome, and I'm sure that there's a lot falling through the cracks and everything like that.
There ought to be an organization that has people that know something about public health, and say if you go to a local TV station in Erie, because that seems to be a place we're talking about a lot, or a talk radio in Erie, and said we have Dr. So-and-so, he's the dean of the Penn State Law School. All right, medical school, and put him in a studio, and this is Talk Radio Erie, 106.5 on your dial. We got Dr. So-and-so of the Hershey, Pennsylvania, medical center. What will we be doing here, doctor? You got to pump that stuff out at every level, and even don't forget, Latino radio, African American radio, wherever people gather, somebody has got to do a giant propaganda campaign and get people from the studios into people's homes. It's something, I don't know, all of these foundations have to get together. It's not going to happen. There's no orders coming from headquarters. We've got to get over that. They're not coming. So what you do is you do what happened at the Battle of Chattanooga. If the whole thing, the northern flank wasn't working, the southern flank wasn't working, and Arthur MacArthur took his regiment and started charging, and Aide looked at Grant and says, "Who ordered those soldiers up there?" And he said, "Nobody, General. They just went."
Yeah.
All right. We're at Missionary Ridge here, people. Grab your piece. Let's go.
So, James, can I ask you a question? Are you writing this action plan someplace? Because what you say...
I've sent a thing to the head to the 10 largest foundations. And I've got another thing I'm trying to get placed to say the people that read the Atlantic do not need convincing. All right? They all know. The people that read the New York Review of Books, I see it, and it's nice, it's patriotic, that they're taking down the paywall. All right? Good. What's the plan to tell somebody that doesn't know? Because that's just the way that this virus works. I mean, people say, well, the racists, who cares? Who gives a shit? Doesn't matter. And there's somebody to listen to. And if I was Bloomberg and I'd go out and bribe people. I do whatever you got to do.
Well, James, you and I have discussed this. When there was the terrible crisis in Haiti, George Bush and Bill Clinton, Barack Obama was president, got together and started a huge relief fund. Obama was secure enough that he wasn't threatened by that. I don't know if I agree with you. I think reaching the churches, reaching the poor sites, reaching the local leaders, that's really, really crucial. But I wonder if, I think, and you have brought this up, if a Clinton and a Bush and an Obama couldn't get together with some kind of, whether we call it propaganda or a message or whatever have you.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, I know they don't have anything to do, because I assure you they don't have any paid speeches, because I've had it's kind of sparse out there, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, I guess they could, but I think this thing has got to be more granular. It's got to be more, we got to do this thing from the bottom up. And if they do something, maybe the current occupant might push back, and people say, well, it's being more political. But we got to extricate politics and everything from this and focus on public health, hand washing, hygiene, distancing. It's the only tool they got, the only tool that they have, until they can come up with some medications, until they can come, with a vaccine. The only good news I've seen in this is a story in the Post that it doesn't, so thus far it has not mutated. So that's some good news, if that stays where it is. Now, Dr. Jerry at Tulane, who discovered, I don't know what you do with a vaccine. Do you discover a vaccine? Do you invent one? I'm not sure what the word is, but the Fallows would know. The Ebola vaccine, and he thinks we're under a year. He's not a year and a half guy, and he's a big high-end guy. I recommend Tulane Public Health site for anybody. And they're working furiously on this, but what we got to do as citizens is we got to give these people time and try to do everything we can to slow this down.
Having been awash in news over the last 2 weeks, I think what you all have been saying in the last few minutes is the most valuable and useful news I've heard from anybody in quite a while. So I would encourage you to do everything you can, with your considerable platforms to get these ideas out. And we'll try in our, we've been concentrating on what people are doing in the likes of Greenville and Erie and Ajo and all the rest. But your strategic plan, I think, really makes sense. So I say get cracking.
Yeah, and I think the other point I think we all agree on is that when things start to get a little bit better, don't get lackadaisical. Don't. I mean, Hong Kong tried that, and it's now coming back. This is not going to go away by Easter. It probably is not going to go away by Memorial Day, and whether it's everything that has to be done: social distancing, washing hands, testing when we can get the equipment. We have to be relentless about it, and it's much better to be more cautious than not. I want to ask both of you one question about the media. I know both of you have taught courses on the media and journalism all over the world. And James, let me start. James Fallows, let me start with you. Margaret Sullivan in the Post had a piece the other day that the press, the media, cable news primarily, shouldn't be covering these Trump propaganda efforts because it is really misleading people. Ordinarily, you'd say, of course, you cover the president. What do you think?
I agree with her argument, and that's something I've been saying in tweets and posts for a while. And interestingly, I've gotten a lot of journalists, maybe 100 to 150 are people who've sort of signed a list saying they agree with that too. And I think the reason is we can see from Donald Trump's point of view, these have become the substitute for the rallies he can't do anymore, where the themes are how great he is, how terrible his critics are, how everybody else is a loser. And so there's that part of his performative art. And the other is just the misinformation that he puts out that only Dr. Fauci has managed to sort of, try to hem back in real time. And I think it's they've become just political rallies, which is unfair, and they leave people worse informed than they were if they just were watching cartoons or porn or whatever else in that time. So if there were a way to, I think if it stopped getting live coverage, Trump would stop showing up, and then you could just have the actual experts go on there and give you a health briefing.
I don't agree with you. Okay, the first thing is Fox and One America Network and talk radio and everything would cover it. And then they'd say they think they know more than you. They're not even covering what our president says. And I think they just drive it worse. I mean, he would, there'd be plenty of Breitbart and everything else would be saying they don't even let the man speak. And maybe if the more traditional people can run a crawl. This is not, in real time. They got expertise. If he says something, run the crawl under that. This is not the fact. All right? You can do that. But any time that you inject politics in this argument, a third of the country is going to shut down on you. And we can't have that. We can't have that. I know, and I understand precisely and exactly what you're saying. But there's the first rule that you learn in campaigns is the other side plays too.
Yeah.
And this is exactly the kind of thing that they would fuel their donor base and the number of clicks they get and everything imaginable. This would, in my opinion, this is smart people talking to other smart people. You got to think like a dumb person.
Oh, that's a segue to me here. Okay.
Deb, you're not a dumb person at all, but you get to weigh in now.
So Deb may be the only one among us who has a PhD. Is that correct? I mean, it's correct about Deb. Is she the only one among us?
Oh, that's an easy call.
Yeah, not here.
Okay, in my doctor role, I'm throwing this out there. Every whatever day of the week at 11:45, we get these blasts through the TV that say, the emergency preparedness horn, and just kind of throws you out of your seat. That is still something that gets people's attention because it's rarely used. Flash flood warning, tornado approaching, something like that. If somebody could hijack that or use it, officially to blast out the message from time to time, wash your hands, stay indoors, and whatever else could be on there, because everybody gets that message. They have to, and it's a public service message. That's my thought drop.
Yeah, I agree. Let me just one more thing about the media, Jim Fallows, because you have written about it so much. I'm conflicted as to whether in the long run, the next year, say, this is going to be good or bad for the traditional press. It seems to me it's an opportunity. I mean, people have to stay home. They have to do something, and there are those that aren't connected, as Deb said, but a lot of people are. And if they do it smart, they don't cut back too much. They cover it extensively. It seems to me, World War II, the Times flourished because they lost money, but they invested. On the other hand, the business model already is in trouble, and this may even further erode that. What's your view?
So I agree with all points of what you're saying. I think journalistically, this is a time where for the media to rise to greatness, and I think a lot of institutions are doing that. I know the Atlantic, where I work, has had in the last 2 weeks by a huge margin the most traffic on its website ever in its history, by like even a factor of 2. And I think it's just getting a lot of attention, doing a lot of responsible things. But I know, not speaking necessarily about our organization, but the digital ad market is just crashing at this moment. That there was a story in one of the papers recently saying that media in general is finding much more attention and much less revenue, even than comparison to the past few years. Local media are, of course, in terrible shape. So I think this highlights the contradictions of the media. We are more and more needed than ever, and I think many doing a good job, and in more and more economic distress. And that is one more part of the equation. And to circle back to one other thing, James, you made the most cogent points that, about why it might backfire to limit coverage of these live news, the briefings, rallies, and maybe the answer is to have the kind of real time crawl saying Trump says the 1918 flu killed half of all the people infected. No, it actually was 2%. And Trump says vaccine is a month away. Actually, it's a year and a half, or whatever. So, yes, this is the media crisis is one more aspect of the crisis. And I have no answer other than, yes, I agree.
This has really been incredibly informative. I mean, you two are just, you understand this, and you understand the country better than most of us. Just any parting thoughts, Deb and Jim? I want you both to get in so we can go for 50 years. So Deb and Jim Fallows, any final thoughts?
Oh gosh. Jim.
And what we're setting up for is I'll say something and Deb will say, actually. That will be the beginning.
She's got the PhD.
Yes, she does. She does. So we have all, speaking now to the four of us, we've been through some bad times for the U.S. through our lifetimes, assassinations and war times and economic collapses and political crises. This one is bad in a different way from what we've ever experienced before. I don't know that it is fundamentally worse than what the country has endured before, but it is, I guess it requires all of our attention to figure out the way that this real, what has become this economic disaster and public health challenge, the way this can bring out what has historically been latent functionality and goodness and unity in the country, and that has lain dormant for a while. So that is our collective goal for the next while, to have yet again a crisis bring out something that is better rather than worse in our nature.
I would just come up with some Pollyanna-ish things, which are true, like it's bringing families closer together, et cetera, and just, namaste to what Jim says.
Listen, we can't thank you all enough. This is really, I want to ask you both if we can. This is not going to go away, and you're going to stay in touch with Eastport and with Greenville and Duluth. So I hope we can get you back on again.
It's a real honor for us, so thank you, and get your message out as far and wide, and we'll try to help in that effort too.
James Carville, let's just for 4 or 5 minutes before we go, politics. Joe Biden is in a bind. Nothing he can do, is there?
No, and he's going to be. I'm not. Other people are. I'm really not worried about winning this election. We're going to win the election if we get to it. And he can't have rallies. He can't do anything. He can sit. He can make phone calls. They can do a video of him. I don't know how much good it does, but make it feel better. They can do that. But there's really not much else you can do. And honestly, if it were up to me, of course, it's not going to happen. No one would go along with it. I'd just suspend all political activity till Labor Day, or that Dr. Fauci and Dr. Briggs give us the all clear.
Well, I would too, but you know someone who won't. And as you say, both sides get to play, and if only one side plays, that's a problem.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I think I agree. I agree totally, and it's just one of these aspirational things. But But my view of this fall is moving so fast, and I'm thinking this is Thursday. That's a week ago that I drove up here from Louisiana, and just the country today is just so much fundamentally different than the country that was a week ago. And we stop and think of where it's going to be by Easter. I mean,
James, I had a Sunday, I had a column that was running in the Hill at 11:30 a.m. And so at 11 o'clock, I phoned in the updated figures on how many cases there were. In 4 days, it more than doubled. I mean, well more than doubled. I mean, that's just, there were 26,000 at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and now there's, close to 60,000. That's the way it's going. And that's why the messages that you are putting out today, the messages that Jim and Deb Fallows are putting out are really, really important. I want everybody out there just, be safe, keep your social distance, isolate yourself, don't take any risk. This thing is real. It's not going to get better for a while, and, it is going to get better, but please, please, please listen to what the doctors and the experts are saying. Wash your hands, keep your distance, isolate yourself, we're not going to see our grandchild. That really breaks my heart. That is the teeniest of sacrifices that one can make. But I want to thank you all for listening to 2020 Politics War Room, and please subscribe, rate, and review. We always ask you to be kind. The podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. For James Carville and from the Sign Institute at American University, I'm Al Hunt. We'll talk to you next week.